I read a controversial article recently that began like this. Jean Audrey Powers, 85 years and counting, wanted to stop counting. She felt herself growing more frail, less clear-headed. She was losing her sight. Worst of all, the woman who once spoke on international podiums was losing her words. However, Jean Audrey, as her many friends called her, was technically not terminally ill, despite waves of mini strokes stealing her senses. California physicians, who are the gatekeepers of the state's End-of-Life Options Act, would not deem her likely to die within 6 months, which is the essential qualification for a lethal prescription that would allow her to choose her final hour. But she was dying to herself, as she knew herself to be. And that was a form of suffering she did not believe that God required of her, of anyone. So the Reverend Jean Audrey Powers, one of the United Methodist Church's leading voices for ecumenism, a champion for LGBTQ rights within her denomination, and someone who knew that the doctrines of her church included one against suicide, bought herself a one-way ticket to Switzerland last September. There she died at peace with her decision. She left 2 requests. One was that her last letter explaining her choice be included in the memorial service program. The second request was that her tombstone read, "Subversive to the end." Talking about death and dying is not our forte. Choosing our own deaths is not politically correct. And seeing death as an act of radical witness is certainly not our preference. But today, as we've been hearing, we are knee-deep in Lent, thinking about how Jesus is always changing the rules, asking us to turn everything we know upside down and look at the world in a whole new way. In today's assigned passage from John's Gospel, Jesus is talking about dying, much to the chagrin of the politically correct around him, and he's switching things up. He's challenging our common understanding. He's changing the rules, as he likes to do. I told you a few weeks ago that we are spending most of our time this Lent in the Gospel of Mark, but Mark has a tendency to be spare on the details, and every once in a while we need a fuller picture of the story. Today we're given a passage from John's Gospel, a lesson that appears in context and sequence that offer some clues to understanding what are truly very difficult words. Right before this passage in John's Gospel, you can look it up, comes our text for next week, Jesus' triumphal ride into Jerusalem. We're reading the passage out of sequence, and this teaching only occurs in John's Gospel. You'll recall the passage today starts with a reference to Greeks, Gentiles who were in town to see the festivities of Passover. Now, there were thousands and thousands of people descending on Jerusalem for Passover. I always think of it like Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Naturally, there would be tourists in town to join the party, even if they weren't devout Jews coming to the temple. But you know, the temple was still the center of all the action, so it certainly would have been a stop on the Gentile holiday tour of Jerusalem. Gentiles, of course, could not go into the temple. That would defile that holy place. Instead, they could stand outside and look in at all the festivities in an area called the Court of the Gentiles. This, by coincidence, also happens to be the unclean place where those who sold animals and traded money would hang out, making it very likely the area that Jesus walked into, got mad, and made a scene. You remember that story from 2 weeks ago, Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers in the temple. You can imagine, with all the people in town, the story of the Jewish rabbi who had come into the court of the Gentiles and chastised the religious establishment for the exploitation of the poor. Well, that story would have spread like wildfire all over the place. Everybody knew what Jesus had done, and everybody wanted just a few minutes of his time. And so that was likely the situation framing our gospel passage today when certain Greeks, the text says, approached Jesus' disciples and asked one of them, Philip, if they could please talk to Jesus in person. This was a shocking request from a Gentile, and then even more shocking that Jesus agreed. It's when they finally make it to Jesus that we hit the heart of this passage. Now, while Jesus has been pretty frank with the disciples up until now, he can clearly see that the tide is turning, and it's likely that the ultimate act of defiance, death, is not that far away for him. It was time, Jesus thought, to speak plainly to the group listening, to talk about what is at the very core of the gospel that Jesus was inviting them to live. So Jesus plunged in and explained that this adventure of following him is serious business. Jesus knew that our lives are ultimately worth very little until we learn what it is we believe so passionately and love so deeply that we would sacrifice our natural human instinct for self-preservation and offer the dearest thing we have, our lives, in return. As you heard, we're fast approaching Holy Week while we tell the story again of Jesus' suffering and death for what he believed and professed. But let's just be honest. We are 21st century Americans who live in a society very tolerant, often endorsing of Christian faith, even the distorted version that clogs our news cycles these days. We know that Jesus died, and we know that many people around the world die for what they believe in, but dying for our faith is not a regular matter of course for Christians in America these days. For us, death is instead wrapped up in the shock and pain of situations like we've experienced in the news, shooting after shooting, and we learn early, death is bad. We should avoid it. Our purpose on earth is not death, but preserving life at all costs. So it's in front of this slick modern backdrop that we hear these shocking words of Jesus. Listen carefully. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it's never more than a grain of wheat. But if it's buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life just as it is destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you will have it forever. So what are we, people intent on self-preservation, both on an instinctual, evolutionary level and on a modern societal level, to do when we hear Jesus' invitation to come and die? Well, we can do what we often do, water it down a little bit, adopt a radical stance right up until it begins to hurt us personally, then pull back to safety. But I'm sorry, I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. Following Jesus means dying for what we believe in has got to be a very real part of our lives. I think maybe the way this passage is framed in John's gospel gives us some way to get a handle on this radical insistence of Jesus that we have to die if our faith is going to mean anything substantive to us. Take a look at the passage. There they were, all standing with him, his devoutly Jewish disciples. And the Greek hangers-on were on the edges of the crowd, looking in curiosity. And looking out at that divided group, people who wouldn't even speak to each other, Jesus uttered his words about dying. Maybe he said them because he knew his own death was imminent. But I think Jesus knew that before his disciples ever reached the point where they could follow Jesus and really physically die for what they believed in, there was a lot more dying that had to happen in their lives. Jesus could see it right there as his Jewish disciples struggled to allow a Gentile to even speak to him. Their sure understanding of God, the one they knew by heart and would never dare to question, that had to die. Their convictions about what role they would play in the coming kingdom Jesus kept talking about had to die. Their preconceived ideas of people who were different were going to have to die Even their old ideas about religion and gender and social class, everything they knew about enemies and material wealth and what it was for sure they thought they needed to survive, all of it, it had to die in order for all that God wanted to create in them to be born. If you and I are serious about following Jesus, this radical, defiant one who challenged every part of what we know and who we are, what are the things in you and me that have to die? I think Jesus' invitation to the crowd that day and Jesus' invitation to us is the same. Come and die. Find out what it is in your life that is limiting your view of what God dreams for you and for this world. Take a good, hard, internal look. You can start right where you are. Maybe he said, turn to the Greek standing next to you and die to your old prejudices that keep you from real relationship and healthy community. Look over there at the temple, symbol of religious institutions that have lost their way and are now in the business of excluding people who don't conform. And die to your former ideas about the limitations of God's love. Think for a minute about God and everything you know God to be, and die to the compulsion to place God in a nice box of your own making. I think Jesus knew that if that crowd was able to step out in faith and start dying, even in these little ways, then like a seed that is planted in the ground and dies, there would be unintended consequences and life would begin to multiply beyond what they even imagined possible. Little by little, one death after another, we put aside our allegiance to self-preservation, whatever it may be, idealistic, spiritual, physical, and we clear room for God's new creation in us. In us. Then if the day ever comes when you and I are asked to hand over our lives, we will be people who know with the deepest conviction what it is we believe, what we would in fact die for, because Jesus knew once we truly know what we will die for, it's then that we begin to live, to reflect the radical teachings of Jesus, to produce seed after seed after seed of kingdom living that will, little by little, change the world. All of us have watched in wonder these past few weeks as children around our country have stepped up this week and asked us to do something, to keep them safe, to stop the violence that makes it dangerous to even go to school these days. For some reason, we find ourselves acting with swift urgency to protect animals on airlines. But our leaders cannot summon the strength of character to speak up and pass laws that will stop gun violence in our country. March for Our Lives, the movement of young people across our country this week came out of a recent tragedy. You know all about the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School that resulted in 17 people killed and countless lives changed forever. Friends, you know as well as I do, this has happened over and over with shocking and now numbing regularity in our country. Children and their teachers facing deadly violence at school. And suddenly this week, it seems their experiences have begun to sprout, like seeds buried in the ground, with growing protests all across our country. All of the lives taken through unnecessary violence, from Sandy Hook to Ferguson to Charleston to Orlando to so many others, have become seeds. They have begun to embody the rallying cry that many modern movements use for justice and peace. The words of a Greek poet: they tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we were seeds. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? In fact, it sounds a little bit like Jesus' words from John's Gospel. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it is never any more than a grain of wheat. But if it is buried and it sprouts, it reproduces itself many times over. Jesus is changing the way we think about dying. Jesus is changing the rules for us this Lent. Instead of running away from death, Jesus is asking us to do a close, hard look at our lives and find the things that need to die to become seeds, falling into the ground and sprouting to new life, life that fosters reconciliation and peace and justice and hope for this world that is way too hopeless. This Lent, we are learning, like Jesus taught us, to change the rules, to die to an old way of life. And as we gather the courage to do that, we, you and me, we will become like seeds that reproduce justice and peace, living lives that become subversive to the end. Amen.